Good morning. It's good to see everyone here this morning, and for those that are joining us from home, we're glad that you're able to join us as well. I want to start by saying the majority of this lesson is probably not going to be what you think it's going to be about. I hope to have a little bit different take on this today, as we'll see in a moment. But I want to take just a moment to kind of tell you what brought me to this particular lesson. My wife and I have had several conversations at home lately, and I want to say that I may mention some things about my wife this morning, and she's prepared for that, but I don't intend that to embarrass her, or I don't intend to single her out from other wives in this room, as hopefully I'll demonstrate through this lesson today. But having several conversations, and then on top of that, I've had I'm going to say privilege, the last many months of this year to be able to work with several of the women in this congregation on a particular project that the elders asked John McFadden and I to take care of. And so I've had a lot of conversations with different folks and interactions, and it's kind of enlightened me. And I'll say, like any man, I sometimes have to have clues laid in front of me. I have to see things, and sometimes God does that, I think. He gives us things that we can see in His Word and in our lives as we go through life, and it really helps us to better understand His Word. And so we want to look at Proverbs, the 31st chapter. We're going to look at the entirety of the chapter and discuss that. And one of the things about the chapter is that there is often a pink view of Proverbs 31. And let me explain that a little bit. I did a little research on this. You know, you can go online into Google, and you can type things in, and you can learn all sorts of things. So I just put Proverbs 31 in there. And what you'll quickly find is there are tons and tons of books and websites and all manner of things written about Proverbs 31. The vast majority of those are written from what I am calling a pink viewpoint. A viewpoint where the cover of the book is pink, and it shows pearls, and it shows lace, and it shows this picture of what is, quote, an ideal woman supposed to be. And we take from that different lessons. And I'll say here that Proverbs 31 has a lot of information in it, and a lot of that information most certainly is such that women can take from that and learn things that they can apply in their lives, and men can look at and learn how to better operate with those women that are in their lives. There's a good view of that comes from those things. So I'm not totally discounting those writings or those things that are talked about. But I think it's important for us to understand the entirety of the chapter of Proverbs 31, because it's the way it's written gives us some good context. I want to talk a little bit about this pink view, though, and some of the challenges that may come about. And in fact, David just talked to me about one this morning that I've actually got here on my slide. So you gave me some good information here. I think one thing that sometimes happens is we can teach the wrong message if we kind of zero in on a certain set of verses from Proverbs 31. You might think of Ralphie's mom here, if you've ever seen this movie. Ralphie's mom was kind of there in the kitchen, and she was kind of frazzled and getting things ready, and I think the statement was made about her that she had not had a hot meal in X number of years, because she was kind of always taking care of the things around the house. And Dad's there, and Dad's kind of focus, as you can see through the movie, is on things outside of life, and kind of grabbing hold of that major award that's out there, if you will. He was really kind of going for that. The problem with the pink view of Proverbs is not the fact that the wife, the mom, is there caring for the home. Certainly that's not the issue. But it's when a dad is turned outward away from the home to the extent that he doesn't really know what's going on and doesn't really participate in the things of the home. And so we can see that wrong message sometimes come across in certain studies of this chapter. It leads to poor relationships sometimes. And by this I mean sometimes we get the idea that the wife must kind of lay down her significance and set that aside for that of her husband. And so she kind of feels like, well, I've got to set aside the things I think and know and do and really kind of continue to prop him up. And the husband can kind of have the reverse look at that and say, well, this is, when I read these passages in here, then she owes me these things and she has to do this, and I get my significance from her being all of these things. It can teach that wrong relationship, and both of those things come from a poor misunderstanding of God's word. You think about Philippians chapter 2, verse 3, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. You see, when that relationship is looking at each other and saying, the other person is better than myself, and I'm looking at that and understanding the value they bring, then we have a proper view of that. It also can lead to a poor mindset for both individuals. We might think of the husband there, and he might say, well, she's not measuring up to this standard. I'm looking at this list of things here, and my wife is just not measuring up to all these things. And so he starts to get kind of an attitude about it, and he says, well, you're just not holding up your end of the deal here, and you're not who you need to be. And that can lead to, again, a poor relationship with each other, but a poor mindset for how we operate. And there you see the wife is saying, I'll never be as important to him as he is to me. She looks at that list and says, I can't live up to that. Like David told me this morning, someone he knew that said, that woman doesn't exist. And I'll tell you that's a lie, because there's a lot of them sitting in this room today. When I was telling Mike about what lesson we were going to do this morning, I said, hey, this is what I'm going to be covering, and we had to get the scripture reading ready, and I don't remember exactly what his response text said, but basically it was to the effect of, we are both blessed by this, by someone in our lives that does these things. And that's certainly the truth. We have to understand that relationship and an understanding of Proverbs 31 has to be driven by the full context of what is stated in there. And if we understand that, then we can really understand what the message is for us to understand there. So, how can we better understand this chapter? I think we have to do several things. First, we have to consider to whom it was written. We have to look at these words and why they were spoken. If you look at the first couple of verses there in Proverbs 31, it says, the words of King Lemuel, the utterance which his mother taught him. What, my son? What, son of my womb? And what, son of my vows? Here is a mother that is speaking these things to her son. And she has spoken these things, and he's writing them back down. He remembers what his mother told him. And so that's the context of Proverbs chapter 31. It's a message that is written to a son to give him advice on how to handle himself in life. We need to consider that the words of Proverbs 31 are both gender and role specific. The things she talks about in there, and even those passages that are kind of extracted out normally, are very gender and role specific. And so when we understand that, we can start to understand that there's a greater context in here and things we should understand. And we also have to consider the pattern of the chapter. How is it laid out for us? And so we look at the first few verses there, 3 through 9, and understand that these are very prescriptive in nature. They give specific commands for this son to follow. She's going to say, this is who you need to be. And then she's going to go into verses 10 through 27, which is the part of Proverbs 31 that is most often talked about, and she's going to give a very descriptive look at this woman and give him something to think about and to envision. And then the last few verses of the chapter again, she goes back to a prescriptive look. And this part is intended really to connect the first section and the second section together and help us understand a lesson that is in there. So let's talk about the prescriptive piece of that first, the first few verses, and break those down. The first thing that we find is that she's telling him to guard his character. She says, you need to guard your character, who you are. Verse 3, do not give your strength to women, nor your ways to that which destroys kings. Now, we've talked about on Wednesday evenings in the Old Testament, and here in some Wednesday evening studies this month, or this last month rather, we have talked about some of the kings. Think about King Solomon and whether or not he listened to this advice. The simple answer is no. He let himself get drawn away by foreign wives. In a sense, they took his strength away from him. I mean, here's a man whom God had given great wisdom, power, wealth, and he gave those things away. He did not guard his character. And so here we see this mom saying, you need to guard your character. You need to watch out for who you are, and don't let yourself get drawn away to things that are going to destroy you. And there's modern day examples of this, but we can certainly fall into the same trap. We can look out in the world and say there's got to be something better, something else that I can go to, just like Solomon did, and we lose our character. She also tells him to guard his mind and his body. Verses 4 and 5, it is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, or for princes intoxicating drink, lest they drink and forget the law and pervert the justice of all the afflicted. She says, you got to take care of your mind. Don't let yourself get caught up in things that are going to destroy your thinking and destroy your body and take you away from your character, who you need to be. We talk about kings and having this issue. If you remember last year, Anderson and I talked several months in a row about the book of Esther. Now think about the king in the book of Esther and whether or not he followed this command. We see early on in the book that he's there with his buddies and he's getting himself intoxicated and he's losing his ability to think clearly and straight. And here, as we see the book of Esther develop, you have this woman that is before him who has so many wonderful, valuable qualities, and yet he can't see them. He struggles to see them because he did not guard his mind, his body. She tells him there at the end of that passage that those things pervert the justice of all those that are afflicted. If you lose the ability to think straight, you're going to lose the ability to understand people that have needs and people that need help from you. And instead, you become selfish and wanting to do what you want to do. She then tells him that he needs to use his words carefully. Verses 8 and 9, open your mouth for the speechless and the cause of all who are appointed to die. Open your mouth, judge righteously, and plead the cause of the poor and needy. She's telling him there, you have words that you can use. There are people who don't have the opportunity, can't speak for themselves for whatever reason. And you need to be able to speak for their cause. Stand up for them. You need to be able to, as she says, judge righteously. You think about if he doesn't have the right character, if he hasn't protected his mind, how is he going to judge righteously, and how is he going to speak for those who can't speak? He's going to become a selfish person. He's going to become someone who doesn't even know what is right and wrong anymore. You need to be the kind of person, she tells him, that can plead for the poor and the needy. So you might say that this is kind of her what every boy needs to know to be a man speech. That's what Proverbs 31 really is, the entirety of it. She's saying you need to know how to live and what is expected of you. It might sound familiar if you look at Proverbs chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. This is what Solomon writes. When I was my father's son, tender and the only one in the sight of my mother, he also taught me and said to me, let your words retain my words, or let your heart retain my words. Keep my commands and live. Parents give advice to their children because they want them to make good, sound decisions and live right in the sight of God. That's where we find life. King Lemuel's mother wanted him to live and live right. And so she's giving him these words to help him grow into the man that he needs to be. And so we then go into the next section there. Again, the section that is often extracted to talk about the worthy woman. But when we understand it in the context of this is a mom telling her son what he needs to understand about life, it starts to give us a little bit more of a clue what she's talking about. So we go into this descriptive section, starting in verse 10, who can find a virtuous wife? For her worth is far above rubies. That word virtuous there is often translated worthy. And it's from that Hebrew word kail, which can mean a force. It means a force. You know, we've heard the statement, he or she is a force to be reckoned with. It's not always used in a nice way sometimes. It's kind of sometimes meant to be, hey, watch out for this person. They're a force to be reckoned with. But it's that idea of here is a person that has the ability to take action and do things in the lives of other people, including, as she's trying to explain to him here, you, King Lemuel, as a husband. She's asking that question, who can find a virtuous wife? And that starts out with that question that was at the beginning slide, who can find? Who can find? We might look at this and we might say, well, perhaps what she's trying to say here is, can anybody really live up to the things that are spoken about in these passages? That was the story that was shared with me earlier, is someone looking at and saying, nobody can do all these things. Nobody can live up to this. Who can do this? That may be one way that we look at it. Men might look at it and say, well, I'm never going to find that. That's never going to exist. Nobody can do all those things. And again, I'll say that's a false way of looking at this. Perhaps what this mother is trying to explain to her son is a couple of things. One, do you have the character to find these valuable qualities in another woman? Are you the kind of man that's going to be able to look at your wife or seek out a wife that has these qualities? Or are you the kind of person that is looking out at other things in the world and turned away from them and you can't even find this and see this? I think that's one way that she may be asking this. And the second part of that then comes about where she may be saying, will you let these qualities perfect your character? Are you going to seek and find these things? And when you find them, are you going to be the kind of person that's going to receive those blessings in your life and perfect who you are as a husband and a father? Or are they going to pass you by? Are you going to be looking out and you just don't find them? Let's think about what she describes there for her son. These various attributes here. She talks about being resourceful. Verses 13 and 14, she seeks wool and flax and willingly works with her hands. She is like the merchant ship. She brings her food from afar. I was talking with Kim about this, and I mentioned to her, I'm going to say it a little differently, but you know, we've gone through several months earlier in this year where out of panic, fear, people were running to the stores and kind of cleaning out the shelves with various things. And during all that, she would go out each week as normal and kind of has a routine, go to the store and bring things back. And I mentioned to her at one point the other day, I said, you know, I hadn't really thought about it at the time, but there was never a time when I could not go to the cabinet and find a roll of toilet paper. Not once. You see on the news, the shelves are cleaned out, and people with shopping carts full of stuff. Never was that not there. just didn't think about it until recently. I thought, I probably should have recognized that a little sooner, but just it was common. She was taking care of those things like a merchant ship, going out into the world, out into the craziness of all the things that were happening, going to 3 and 4 stores throughout the day and running all over the place to find what we needed and find what others needed. She was doing those things. That's being resourceful. And we see this. So if we put this in context, I should have mentioned this a moment ago, think about that question, who can find? And are you, I'll speak to the men in the room, are you the kind of person that can see these valuable things and how they can be of value to you? Can you find those things? Can you find resourcefulness in your wife? There's the idea of being a provider. We typically put this word on men and say, well, they're providers and play that role, but certainly that's not what this mother tells her son. Verse 15, she also rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household and a portion for her maidservant. She is not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household is clothed with scarlet. She makes tapestry for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. The idea of being a provider, seeing the needs and making sure that they are taken care of. And doing so sometimes through long nights, late nights, early mornings, those types of things. Are you the kind of person that will see that value in your wife? Financial abilities are talked about. She considers a field and buys it. From her profit, she plants a vineyard. There's this idea of being able to understand when you can take one thing and use it and be resourceful, again, if we use that word, and do things with that and make something else out of it. I dare say there's probably not a husband in this room, either as a young man growing up with a mom who may have done this, or even with their own wife, who probably did not experience a woman in their life who was able to take seemingly little and make much out of it. I know when we were first married, like I guess everybody is first married, you don't have any money and you kind of scraping by all the time and all those sorts of things. And I've always recognized this in my own wife because I've said it before, I don't like balancing checkbooks. I just hate anything to do with accounting. I'll just say that. I will never, ever be an accountant. I took about 2 days of an accounting class in college and walked out. I said, I'm never doing it. This is not for me. But yet, my wife, I should say love. She likes numbers, I'll say that, so can recognize that. But the idea that someone can recognize and kind of be able to understand how to use things and work them and have those abilities is something that we can recognize and use for good. There's the idea of strength, being strong. It says there in verse 17, she girds herself with strength and strengthens her arms. Strength and honor are her clothing. She shall rejoice in time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and on her tongue is the law of kindness. Who can find the strength in their wife? The word strength there is from the word oz, and it kind of has this concept of personal, social, political strength. I would say it is, here's a person who knows what they believe, and they stand by that. Think about the words of Paul where he said, I know whom I have believed and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I've committed unto him against that day. That is strength. And that's what we see and find in our wives, is someone that is committed to what they know, and they stand by those things. They have that strength. The word strengthens there is from the word amates, meaning to be brave, bold, determined, or assured. I didn't put it on the screen. It can even mean obstinate. That kind of sounds like a negative word to me, so I didn't put that on there. But it's that idea of being bold and brave, determined, being assured of what they are confident in, what they know, their strengths. And so we might say there that she is confident in her beliefs, but she's also kind to others. And I draw that out of that statement because at the end of that in verse 26, on her tongue is the law of kindness. This is not an individual that is so determined and has ideas that she's going to bulldoze over everybody and kind of plow through and just tell everybody they're wrong. But she does so lovingly, and she tries to share her strengths with others, but does so with kindness. Again, I'll ask you, are you the kind of person that can find that in your wife? She works hard. I can tell you, I've learned this from working with several of the ladies here in the congregation, and of course with my wife, and many of the things she does. It says there in verse 18, she perceives that her merchandise is good, and her lamp does not go out by night. She stretches out her hands to the distaff, and her hand holds the spindle. She watches over the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. She works hard. I'll start with this example. You know, I've been working with now since, March, I think, with several of the ladies here and kind of helping organize an effort that we have going. And I'll tell you, more often than not, they're coming to me and saying, hey, we need to do this, that, or the other thing, and here's why. Can you help us kind of make sure we get it organized? You see, they work hard at what they do to provide for others. And I told, I don't remember if it was Mike or Matt or maybe Dale, somebody one day, I said, I don't have to do a lot with this. Sometimes they act like I'm doing a lot, but the truth is, they're doing the work. You can put these things before these women in our congregation, and they run with it. Remember what I said, that idea of virtuous or worthy? It's a force. They are able to move and do things, and do so very effectively. Verse 19 there, I just have to tell this real quick. I asked Kim the other day, I said, have you stretched out your hand to the distaff today? I want you to, I don't want us to, I'm not trying to embarrass her, but if you get a chance, look at Annie's hair. That is 3 days and at least 14 hours worth of work. And, watching her work that, and at the end of the day, hands being almost where they won't open up, where you can almost unclench your hands. That's that image I get. You know, that idea of the staff and the spindle, it's the idea of a spinning wheel and making thread and cloth and doing those things. But it stuck in my mind as here's a modern example of that, of working on something and spending hours on that. To the point where your hands almost won't work. Hard work. We may not always see that in the women that are sitting in this room, but they work hard, very hard. And sometimes they put a lot of hours and late nights and early mornings into the things that they do. And so the question becomes, are we the type of men that will recognize and find those things? We find there in verse 20, she cares for others in need. She extends her hand out to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. One of the things that we probably often don't recognize about our wives is the times that they do this. And we might not even know that. Where they see a need in someone and they take care of it quietly, with little fanfare, little notice. You know, I grew up in a home where my mom was one that absolutely did not want, and she's still this way today, does not want anybody to know anything that she does for anybody. She absolutely hates when anybody knows that she's done anything. Yet living in the home, I was able to observe this growing up. Observe someone that would find needs and go care for them. Watch her when an elderly woman in the congregation had no family and needed daily care. And she would drive over every day, see to her needs for years. Our wives care for others in need, and sometimes we don't see it. The question is, do we seek those? Are we the kind of person that will find those things? And I left this one at the end because we need to understand that she is a blessing to her husband. It says there in verse 11, the heart of her husband safely trusts her, so he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not evil all the days of her life. Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. We find there, first of all, the idea of trust. Gentlemen, your wife is someone that you can trust above anyone else. And she trusts you. And so we have to understand that that's such a great blessing to us. To have someone in this life that is there with us, whom we can have that relationship with. We may struggle with that with others in the world. We may struggle to have trust amongst those, and people break our trust. But with our wife, we can see that as a great blessing to us and develop that trust and nurture that trust. We find that she continues there, no lack of gain. I pull out the thought about not lacking because I want to be very clear that my observations in life and looking out at others in life is that oftentimes we can fall into the trap of thinking something is lacking. We can look at our wives and say, well, these things are lacking. That's why when I talked about that pink view of that verse, we can start to take that list and say, well, you didn't put your hand to the distaff today. We got a gap here. That's not what she's talking about to her son here. She says, you need to understand you're not lacking when you have this person in your life. We can look at a lot of things in life and say, oh, I don't have this, that, or the other thing. But when we have this person in our life, we have gained something so wonderful. We don't have that lack of gain in our life. Everything else is just trivial. She does him good and not evil. Another thing that we need to think about is all the good that comes from our wives. The wonderful things they do for us each and every day. They're not out there to do us harm. It says there, she does good and not evil all the days of her life. She's out there working day in and day out and doing good for us. It's important that we recognize that. And lastly there, I worded this a little differently because I want to be clear on what this means. By her, he is known among others. The statement there in verse 23 says, her husband is known in the gates. I've always looked at this, I'm going to admit a failure here. I've always looked at this and said, this worthy woman must be worthy because her husband is a great man. He's a man that sits out in the world and everybody knows who he is, and therefore she's worthy. She's picked the cream of the crop, the best there is, and so she's worthy. I don't think that is at all what is being taught here. Her husband is known in the gates. As we'll see in just a moment, it would appear that he is lifted up. He is known because of what she does each and every day, the work that she does. Gentlemen, we're often made great, or to look great, by the work of others. I mentioned all those ladies that are doing this work. I'm doing a little organization with it, but they're doing a lot of work behind the scenes. And I think it's the same with our wives. They're doing a lot of work that helps us to be known in the world. Let's talk about the final prescriptive commands. Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Charm is deceitful and beauty is passing, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. There's the idea of praise there that is mentioned over and over again in this section. It is so important that we understand the need to praise those that are in our life. Our wives, the other women that we come in contact with that work and do things that we recognize. Such a wonderful thing and something that we should praise over and over again. To do this, she gives some ways that we can help ensure this happens. One is to teach your children to praise her by doing so yourself. Praise your wife in front of your children. Let them see that you recognize the value she brings, and they will learn to do the same. If you have young boys in your house and you're teaching them this, as they grow older and they develop their own relationships, hopefully they look at some that are in their lives and say, I can praise you for these things that you're doing. And if you have young ladies in your house that are growing up, hopefully they can understand that the efforts they make day in and day out will be praised and appreciated and valued. Praise her love of God and nurture that in the home. This is something my wife and I are talking about more, about ways that we can continue and do this even more and better in our own home, to nurture that love of God and appreciation for God and that fear of God as the mother talks about here. You see, she puts this picture in front of us and says, a person that fears God is that ideal person. They become a great force for good in the world around them. And then finally, give her credit publicly. Verse 31, let her own works praise her in the gates. What we just read a minute ago is her husband is known in the gates. Well, how is he known in the gates? Part of that has to do with he recognized the value that his wife brings, and he tells others about it, and they can see those actions. And here he is in the gates and in public in the world, and they say, aren't you so-and-so's husband? Aren't you isn't she the one that, fill in the blank, does these things? That's why I think my view on this for a long time has been really wrong, because she does her own things, and those things praise her publicly. And we can continue to help with that and make sure others are aware of the things. That was hard I mentioned the story of my mom. That was hard for my dad growing up because, he couldn't go out in the world and say, hey, look at what she did. She didn't want any of that. But it's important to note here, her own works praise her in the gates. Even if we're not out blowing the trumpet and shouting and putting up banners, the good that this person does will be noticed and will be seen. There's a warning there. Charm deceives and beauty fades. She's saying, son, you got to be careful of what you're looking for in a wife. If you're looking for the wrong things here, if that's your goal, you're going to be disappointed down the road. You see, when he's looking for all these other attributes, the true beauty of that person shines through. It's not that charming and deceitful thing there that will fade away with time. It's the kind of real lasting beauty that will go forever. I was talking to, and maybe, hopefully he's listening today, but I was talking outside a few weeks ago with Dale and Debbie, and I don't know how we got on the topic, but he made mention of, as we grow older, our ability to look at our wives and women around, we continue to see them as beautiful. even over the passage of time as we age. They become, I would say, more beautiful to us with time. The kind of thing she's warning about is something that if we get hung up on it, we're going to be disappointed. So we need to look for the woman that fears the Lord. Well, here's some final thoughts. We might think of the passage in Genesis where God said, "It is not good that man should be alone. I will make a helper comparable to him." I want to note here that this is God saying this. God who created all things, God who looked at all his creation and said it is good. God who created man and woman and said it is very good. He looked at man and said, it's not good for him to be alone. He needs someone. He needs a helper. And so God made provision for that through women, through our wives. The reason for that is that we need to be able to understand what God intended for the church. If you go over to Ephesians chapter 5, and we won't read through the entirety of that section, but he says there in verse 25, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her." So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. You see, God in the beginning said man needs a helper. Man needs someone there, and the reason man needs that is man needs to understand how to guard his character, how to guard his mind, how to guard his thoughts, who he is, and guard all those things and be able to have that right relationship with God and be part of the church. In Ephesians, Paul describes that relationship of husbands and wives and compares it to the church. You see, our wives help us to understand that relationship. They help us to live that relationship and be who God intends us to be. He who loves his wife loves himself. And so I ask you again that question that the mother poses to her son, who can find? I'm going to tell you that this person is out there. She is among us. I'm looking at many of them today. I'm looking at younger women that are growing and developing, and as they become older, they will become this in their lives. I'm looking at those that have lived more in life and are teaching others that are younger to do these things. We as men in this congregation should be able to look at our wives and have that appreciation for them and find the value that they bring to us. And so I think this all boils down to this one final thought. She makes the statement here talking about praise. She says, you need to understand and be able to make the statement. Many daughters have done well, but you excel them all. This is not a statement that we look out and say, my wife's better than your wife. It's not a bumper sticker we put on our car and drive around and kind of thumb our nose at everybody else and say, we're better than you. That's not that at all. It's the ability to find the value in our wives. It's the ability to look at the other women that we come in contact with, that we see here today, and find the value and be able to praise them for those things and show them that they've done well. I hope the message today and maybe this slightly different view of this has been helpful. I hope it helps us to think about our relationships to our wives, and if you're a young man that is not married and will someday, I hope it makes you think a little bit about the character you have and are developing and who you need to be and who you will seek out as a mate. And young ladies, I hope that helps to maybe put into perspective some of why these things are important, because we need that help. God recognized that. If God, who created all things, recognized that, hey, you guys need some help and gave it to us, then certainly we should be able to value and praise you for those things. If today someone is here who has a need, we always want to offer an invitation. If you're someone that has not ever put on the Lord in baptism, you've never committed your life to Him, you've never said to God, I want to follow you, then we would ask you that you would let us know that today. If your heart's being pulled and you say, I need to live that life, I need to make a change, I need to become something different, then this is a great time to do that. We would welcome you and be prepared to help you make that step. If you're someone who feels like you need to study more and you don't know what those answers are, then certainly let us know that as well. If you're at home and you're joining us remotely and you have those questions, then we would invite you also to contact us, and we will reach out to you and help you seek and find those answers. If you're someone that has a need for prayer, if you're struggling in life, if you have a difficulty that we need to pray for, then please let us know that as well. Whatever needs you may have, we would invite you to stand with us and sing together.